The Duke of Sherbornne was halfway through his vows when the door at the back of the church opened, and though he did not yet know it, every settled thing in his life had begun to come apart. He did not hear the door. He was looking at the bishop, or rather at a point just past the bishop's shoulder where the great east window let in a fall of late morning light, and he was saying the words he had been given to say in the low, even voice that the congregation had come to expect of him, to love, to cherish, to keep. The words moved through him without resistance. He had practiced a kind of resignation so thoroughly over the past 3 years that it had taken on the texture of peace, and he mistook the one for the other, as a man might mistake a stilled pond for a shallow one, never having had cause to learn its depth. Diana Holloway stood beside him in white silk and Honiton lace, her gloved hands folded, her chin level. She was a handsome girl of good family and steady nerves, and if she felt anything as the Duke spoke, it did not show. She had been told from the schoolroom onward that a great deal of life would be arranged for her, and she had found this to be true, and had decided some years ago that the arranging went more easily when one did not struggle against it. The Duke had always been kind to her. He had also, in every conversation they had ever shared, been somewhere else behind his eyes, attending to her with the courteous half of himself while the other half remained shut and dark. She had noticed this. She had not minded it as much as perhaps she ought. One did not, she had reasoned, marry a duke for the warmth of his attention. So it was Diana who noticed first that something in the room had changed. It came to her not as a sound, but as a movement at the edge of her vision, a turning, the small collective shift of a great many people who had been facing forward, beginning, one by one, to face back. A rustle of silk and stiff coats, a murmur that was not quite a murmur, more the held breath that precedes one. She did not turn herself. She kept her chin level and her eyes on the bishop, because she had been raised to keep her composure in all circumstances, and because she had begun, with a curious lightness in her chest, to suspect what the turning meant. The Duke spoke on, to honor and protect. At the back of the church, a woman stood in the open doorway, and the daylight behind her was so bright that for a moment she was only a shape against it, dark and still. She wore no wedding finery. She wore a plain traveling dress of gray merino, dusty at the hem, and a bonnet that had been rained on at some point in the last 2 days and dried crooked, and she carried nothing in her hands. She had the look of someone who had come a very long way without stopping to consider how she would appear at the end of it. Her face was pale and composed in the particular way of a person holding herself together by an act of will, and she did not move from the threshold. She only stood and looked at the man at the altar and waited for him to feel it. Her name was Eliza Tarant. 3 years before, she had been going to marry him. She had not come to make a scene. She had told herself this in the carriage, and again on the post road when she changed horses, and again on the stone steps outside, and she believed it. She had no speech prepared. She had no claim she meant to press in front of 300 people, half of whom she did not know, and the other half of whom had never known she existed. She had come only because 2 days ago a letter had reached her that had unmade the entire architecture of the life she had so carefully built, and because once it had reached her, she had understood that she could not let him say the words. Not these words. Not to the wrong woman. Whatever followed, whatever humiliation, whatever it cost her standing or her peace, she could not stand in a clergyman's parlor 40 miles away and let it happen unwitnessed while she stayed prudent and quiet and safe. She had been prudent and quiet and safe for 3 years. It had nearly cost her everything, and she had not even known. The Duke felt it. He could not have said what it was. A draft, perhaps, from the open door, or the strange settling silence of the congregation, which had stopped its rustling and gone entirely still. But more than that, before either of those, he felt something turn over in him at the level beneath thought, the way a sleeper feels a familiar voice in a dream and begins to wake before he knows why. The vow he was speaking faltered on his tongue. He had said this voice's name 1,000 times in the early grieving, and then had taught himself, deliberately and over long months, to stop. He had buried it, and now some buried part of him stirred at a presence in the room and reached toward it before his reason could intervene. He turned. He turned mid-word, the unfinished vow hanging in the air, and he looked down the long aisle to the open door and the woman standing in it, and he stopped breathing. The bishop, who had been reading from the prayer book in his comfortable practiced murmur, glanced up at the silence. He followed the Duke's gaze to the back of the church. Slowly, without being told to, without quite knowing why he did it, he lowered the book. For a moment that seemed to stretch beyond the ordinary measure of moments, no one in the church moved at all. The light came down through the east window in its long gold bars. The flowers banked against the chancel rail gave off their heavy fragrance. Diana Holloway stood in her wedding silk and watched the Duke's face, and on it she read, with perfect clarity and no surprise whatsoever, the answer to a question she had never let herself ask aloud. His face had opened. The shut, dark half of him that she had felt in every conversation and never reached had come open all at once, like a door, like a window, flung wide in a house that had been closed up for years, and what poured out of it was not for her, and had never been for her. She felt the strangest thing then. She felt relief, clean and immediate, as though a weight she had agreed to carry without ever agreeing had been lifted from her by a hand she did not have to thank. "Eliza," the Duke said. It was not loud. It carried to the back of the church only because nothing else dared to make a sound. But the whole congregation heard it, and the name moved through them like wind through a field of wheat, head bending to head, and from somewhere near the front came the sharp, indrawn breath of a woman who had hoped never to hear that name spoken in this place. The Dowager Duchess of Sherbornne sat very upright in the front pew, and she did not turn around. Lucas Pevensey came down from the altar. He did not run because he was not a man who had ever in his life run anywhere, but he came down the chancel steps and along the aisle with a directness that scattered the small understandings of 300 people before him. Diana he did not look at. He would think later, with shame, that he had forgotten her entirely in that moment, had left her standing at the rail in her wedding dress as though she were a chair he had risen from, and he would have to make that right, and he would. But he did not think of it then. He thought of nothing then but the figure at the end of the aisle who had not moved, who stood and waited for him with her chin lifted and her hands empty, and her gray traveling dress dusty at the hem, and who was watching him come with an expression he could not read and was terrified to read, because if it was anger he could bear it, and if it was indifference he could not. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough now to see that her eyes were bright and her jaw was set against trembling. "You stopped writing," he said. It was the first thing in his mind, and so it was the first thing out of him, 3 years of grief compressed into 4 flat words. "You broke it off. You accepted Hartwell. I was told I never accepted anyone." Her voice was low and steady, schooled by the same long discipline that had kept her upright on the post road. "I wrote to you 4 times, my lord, after your letters stopped. I waited a year. I thought—" The steadiness cracked very slightly, and she pressed it back into place. "I thought you had changed your mind about me. I thought a duke might think better of a clergyman's daughter in the cold light of things, and I taught myself not to blame you for it. I built a life on that. 2 days ago, a woman who was dying sent for me to confess what she had carried for 10 years, and I learned that I had built my whole life on a lie your mother told us both. The word your mother went into the silence like a stone into still water." In the front pew, the Dowager Duchess sat unmoving, her gloved hands folded on the head of her cane, her profile composed and pale and proud. She had heard. She had heard all of it. She did not turn around, and in not turning around, she said more than any defense could have. Lucas looked back at her once, then he looked at Eliza again, and something in his face was breaking and remaking itself at the same time, and he said very quietly, "Come away from here. Not like this, in front of all of them. Come away and tell me everything from the beginning. I have 3 years to understand, and I will not understand them standing in a doorway." Eliza Tarant looked past him, once down the aisle, at the girl in the white dress standing alone at the altar rail. Diana met her eyes across the whole length of the church, and to Eliza's astonishment, the girl gave her the smallest possible inclination of the head, a thing almost too slight to be called a nod, and in it was no resentment at all, only a kind of grave and tired permission. "Go on," it said. "He was never mine." Eliza inclined her head in return. Then she turned and walked out of the church into the bright noon, and the Duke of Sherborne followed her, and behind them 300 people erupted at last into the sound they had been holding back, while at the front of the church a girl in white quietly unpinned her veil, and an old woman with a cane sat alone in her pew and stared at the empty altar as though it had betrayed her. What had happened was this, and Eliza told it to him in the cool stone vestry while the church emptied of its bewildered guests, and he listened with his hands gripping the back of a chair until the knuckles showed white. 3 years before, when he was 23 and she but 20, they had reached an understanding. It had been done quietly and properly, with her father's blessing and his own private joy, and if it had not yet been announced to the world, it was only because the Duke's mother had asked, with what had seemed at the time like reasonable caution, that they wait a season before making it public. He had loved Eliza with the whole uncomplicated force of a young man who had not yet learned that the world could take a thing from him. He had written to her every week he was away, long letters full of the small business of his days and the large business of his heart, and her letters had come back to him just as faithful. Until the spring he had gone north for 3 months to attend to a matter of his late father's affairs, and somewhere in those 3 months her letters had stopped. He had written more often, alarmed. Nothing came. And then, when he was sick with worry, his mother had come to him with her face arranged into sorrow and had told him gently, as one breaks the worst news, that she had heard from a friend of the Tarant family that Eliza had reconsidered, that she had found the prospect of a duchess's life daunting, that there was a Mr. Hartwell, a solicitor of comfortable means and ordinary station, more suited to her temperament, and that she had accepted him. His mother had been very kind about it. She had said that Eliza was a sensible girl to know her own measure, and that it was better the boy learned now than later that sentiment and suitability were not the same thing. He had not believed it. He had ridden south through 2 days of rain to demand the truth from Eliza herself. And he had arrived at the village to find the parsonage shut up, the family gone to a relation in the next county for some weeks, and a single letter waiting for him at the inn. In a hand he had been too distraught to examine closely, returning his last letter to him unopened and asking, with a coldness that did not sound like her at all, that he write no more. "I never wrote that," Eliza said. "I never received a single letter of yours after the march. I wrote to you 4 times that spring and into the summer. I thought you had simply gone silent. I thought—" She stopped, and when she went on, her voice had gone quieter, as though she were describing a country she had lived in alone for a long time and was only now permitting another soul to enter. "I cannot tell you what it is, my lord, to be left without a reason. If you had written and told me plainly that you had reconsidered, I should have grieved and recovered and known where I stood. But there was no letter. There was only the slow understanding, week upon week, that none was coming, and a woman is left to invent her own reasons in that silence, and the reasons she invents are always the cruelest ones. I decided that you had looked at me clearly at last and found me wanting. A clergyman's daughter with a clergyman's portion in a parsonage that smelled of damp in the winter. I decided that a duke does what dukes do, and that I'd been foolish to imagine otherwise, and I taught myself the lesson so thoroughly that I came almost to be grateful for it, the way one is grateful to be cured of a fever even by a bitter draught. I refused 2 offers in those years. I told my father I was content as I was. I kept my father's house and visited the sick of the parish and read in the evenings, and I built a life so quiet and so careful that there was no corner left in it where a thing could come in and wound me. And then, 2 days ago, a letter came that pulled the whole of it down in an afternoon, and I understood that I had spent 3 years grieving a man who had never let me go, and being grateful to be cured of a love that had been stolen from me rather than lost. She drew a breath. It does not matter now what I thought. I only want you to know that I did not stop. Whatever else, my lord, I never once stopped. Where were the letters, he said. His voice had gone strange. Yours to me, mine to you. Where did they go? It was the dying woman's confession that answered him. Her name had been Sarah Coyle, and she had been a housemaid at Sherbornne 3 years before, a girl of 17, devoted past sense to the Dowager Duchess, who had taken her up out of the village and trusted her with small private errands. For the better part of a year, on the Dowager's instruction, Sarah Coyle had carried away the letters. The ones that came for the young duke from the parsonage she had taken from the hall table before he saw them and brought to his mother. The ones he wrote and left to be franked and sent she had intercepted in the same way. The Dowager had read them, every one, and burned some and kept others, and had let the young people's silence do its slow work upon them both. and when the silence had ripened sufficiently, she had supplied the rest, the false news of Hartwell to her son, and to Eliza, nothing at all, only the great and final eloquence of a man who had ceased to write. She had even, near the end, arranged the returned letter at the inn, a letter Eliza never wrote, in a hand close enough to fool a man too grieved to look. Sarah Coyle had carried it for 10 years. She had married and left service and borne children and never told a soul. And now she was dying of a wasting fever at 30, and she could not go into the ground with it. She had asked for a clergyman to write down her confession, and then she had asked that it be sent to the clergyman's daughter at her old direction, and by the grace of God or the persistence of the parish, the letter had found Eliza 2 days before the wedding that the whole county had been talking of for a month. "She begs my forgiveness," Eliza said, "and your father's pardon, who is dead, and God's mercy. She says she was a girl who did not understand what she did, and that she has understood it every day since. I cannot find it in me to hate her. She is dying. She told the truth at last, at great cost, when she might have died silent and easy." Eliza looked at the letter in her own hands, worn now from much reading. "I find it harder to forgive the one who set her to it, and has not in 10 years suffered a single day of doubt over it." Lucas Pevensey said nothing for a long while. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet and very level, and it was the most dangerous his mother would ever have heard it had she been there to hear. "She will answer for it," he said, "not with cruelty. I will not become what she is in order to punish what she did, but she will answer for it." He found his mother in the small parlor of the great house that evening, where she had retired in lieu of the wedding breakfast that had not taken place. She was seated by the fire with her embroidery, perfectly composed, and she did not look up when he came in. "You have made a spectacle of us," she said, drawing her needle through the linen, "before the whole county. I hope the satisfaction was worth the talk it will cost us for a 12-month. You read my letters," he said. "For a year. You burned them. You told her I had gone cold, and you told me she had taken another man, and you watched the two of us grieve, and you let it stand for 3 years. I did what was necessary." She set down the embroidery at last and looked at him, and there was no flinching in her, no shame, only the serene conviction of a woman who has never once in her life entertained the possibility that she might be wrong. "You were 23 and besotted with a clergyman's daughter who had nothing, who could bring nothing to this house but a pretty face and a parsonage manner. You sit in the House of Lords, you hold land in 4 counties and a name older than the throne, and you would have thrown it after a girl whose father preaches to plowmen, because at 23 you mistook a fever for a calling." She lifted her chin. "I cooled the fever. In a year you had recovered. In 2 you were grateful. I was not wrong to do it. I was only wrong, it seems, in the choice of the maid I trusted to keep it quiet. You were wrong," he said, "in the choice to do it at all, and you will not do its like again. Not to me, not in this house, not to any soul under my protection." "And what do you intend?" she said, with the faint contempt of a woman who has held the reins of this house for 30 years and cannot conceive of their being taken from her. "To do?" What he did was this. He did it without raising his voice over the weeks that followed, and it was the more complete for being quiet. He did not turn his mother out in anger or denounce her to the county. He simply ceased, for the first time in his life, to arrange the world around the gravity of her will. The dower house, which had stood ready for her these 10 years, and which she had always declined to inhabit on the grounds that her son still needed her hand on the household, was opened, aired, and made comfortable, and the dowager removed to it before the month was out, not under cruelty, but under the unanswerable pressure of a son who had stopped pretending he required her. Her standing invitations to the great families of the neighborhood, which had always come addressed to her as the Lady of Sherbornne, began, by some gradual and unspoken adjustment, to come addressed to the new Duchess instead, when there was a new Duchess, and even before there was, they thinned, as such things thin when the one who issued them is no longer the one who matters. The household, which had taken its temperature from the dowager for a generation, learned within a season to take it from elsewhere. She was not banished. She was simply, finally, no longer obeyed, and for a woman who had ruled through being obeyed, it amounted to the same thing, delivered without a single harsh word, which she found harder to bear than any open quarrel could have been. Diana Holloway, He went to the very next morning, before he allowed himself any happiness at all, because he owed her that and he knew it. He found her calmer than he had any right to expect. She received him in her father's drawing room with her hands folded and her color good, and she let him say all the things a man must say to a woman he has left at an altar before 300 people. And when he had finished, she told him, with a frankness that did him good, that he need not distress himself on her account. "I was not in love with you, sir," she said simply. "I think you knew it. I think you were not in love with me, and I knew that rather better. We were both of us doing as we had been bid, and doing it civilly. And I dare say we would have rubbed along well enough and been no more unhappy than half the married people of our acquaintance." She smiled, and it was a real smile, and there was something almost merry in it now that the thing was undone. "But I find I am very glad not to have to. I had not let myself know how glad until I saw your face turn round in that church. You looked, sir, like a man waking up. I'd never seen you awake before. I am happy for you, and I confess I am happier still for myself." It was said in the county afterward that Miss Holloway had been jilted and ought to have been crushed by it. But Miss Holloway did not appear to have read the script the county had written for her. She went to her aunt in Bath for the autumn season, and there she met a Mr. Ashby, a younger son with a good living and a quick wit, and a way of looking at her as though she were the only person in the room. And within the year there was a quiet announcement that surprised no one who had seen the two of them together. And Diana was married before the next summer to a man who was nowhere behind his eyes when he spoke to her, but entirely present, and she counted herself, with reason, the most fortunate of the three of them. Lucas and Eliza were married some weeks after the broken wedding, quietly, in the same church, with the daylight coming down through the same east window. There was no crowd this time. The household was there, and Eliza's father, who married them himself with his voice not quite steady, and a handful of close family, and Diana Holloway, who came of her own accord and sat smiling in a back pew and wept a little to her own surprise when the vows were said. The Dowager Duchess attended under sufferance, because her son had asked it, and because to refuse would have been to confirm everything the county whispered, and she sat very upright in the front pew in gray silk and watched her son marry the clergyman's daughter she had spent a year and 3 years of consequence to prevent. There was a moment near the end. The bishop asked, as bishops do, whether any present knew cause why these two should not be joined. And into the silence the dowager drew a small sharp breath, the kind of breath that in the past had always preceded her speaking, and had always silenced the room, and bent the day to her purpose. Every head did not turn, because the household had learned better than that, but a stillness gathered, an old reflex of waiting for her word. Lucas did not turn around. He had been looking at Eliza, and he went on looking at Eliza, and over his shoulder, without raising his voice, in front of the bishop and his bride and Diana and the whole assembled household, he said, "There is none, mother. The matter is settled." It was a small thing. It would not have seemed to a stranger like very much at all, but there was not a soul in that church who did not understand what had just occurred, least of all the Dowager Duchess, who let out her breath slowly and said nothing, and folded her hands on the head of her cane and looked at the floor. He had never in his life contradicted her before witnesses. He had contradicted her now, gently, finally, and turned his back on her to face his wife, and the turning of his back was the whole of his answer to 3 years and a stolen year before them, and it was enough. They were married, and they went out into the bright noon together, and this time he did not leave anyone behind him at the altar. Several years on, the estate at Sherbornne kept a different rhythm than it had once kept. The gardens that had run to a stiff formal order under the dowager's eye had been let to soften here and there into something with more air in it, and the morning room that had stood mostly shut was opened daily now to the light. Eliza oversaw the running of the great house through Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, and through Selby, the steward, as the duchess of such a house must, with a quiet thoroughness that the household had come, somewhat to its own surprise, to prefer. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The servants had served under a mistress who ruled by the held breath and the lowered glance, and they found they would walk a good deal further for a mistress who simply trusted them to do their work and noticed when it was done well. There was a child by then, a boy of 2 with his mother's steadiness and his father's slow, grave smile and the early expectation of another. Lucas, who sat in the House of Lords and attended to 4 counties and the great machinery of a great inheritance, came home from all of it as a man comes home, and was at home there in a way he had not been at home anywhere in the years between 3 and 20, and the morning a door opened at the back of a church. The Dowager Duchess lived on at the Dower House. She softened in the end, though not quickly and not all at once. It was the boy who did it, in the way that children sometimes undo in their grandparents what no argument could touch, toddling to her without fear and demanding to be told stories, indifferent to the long, cold history that hung between her and his mother. Eliza permitted the visits. She never pretended a warmth she did not feel, but she never poisoned the boy against the old woman either. And over the years, a kind of careful, unspoken truce grew up between the two women, built not on forgiveness exactly, but on the daily necessity of a shared grandchild and the slow erosion of pride by time. The Dowager never said she was sorry. But once, when the boy was 4, Eliza came upon her in the garden with the child on her knee, telling him in a low voice about his father as a small boy, and the old woman was crying quietly, in a way she would have died before letting anyone witness, and Eliza turned and went back into the house and never spoke of it, and that, between them, was as near to peace as the two of them would ever come, and it was nearer than either had once thought possible. It was in the 5th year that Eliza found the letters. She was clearing out an old writing desk that had stood disused in a small upstairs room, a heavy mahogany thing of her late father-in-law's that had been pushed into a corner and forgotten, and at the back of a drawer that stuck and then gave way all at once, she found a packet of letters tied with a faded ribbon. She knew her own hand before she had read a word of them. 4 letters, the seals broken, the paper softened with age and reading. They were the 4 she had written that long ago spring and summer into the silence, when she had still believed he might answer. They had reached the house after all. They had crossed the miles and arrived and been carried in from the hall table by a frightened girl of 17, and they had never traveled the last 20 feet to the man they were meant for. They had been read by someone else and judged and tied up with a ribbon and put away in the back of a drawer to be forgotten, and forgotten they had been, until now. She sat down on the floor of the little room with the letters in her lap and read them through, the words of the girl she had been, 20 years old and certain of the future, writing into a silence she did not yet know was manufactured. She did not weep. She had done her weeping years ago, over a different and emptier grief than this. She read them, and she felt for the girl who had written them a great tenderness, and she felt for the man who should have read them and never had a clean grief that no longer had any sting in it. She did not need the letters. The thing they had asked for she had now, in the house around her and the child asleep down the corridor and the man who would come home that evening and find her and be glad. The letters were the record of a wound long since healed over, and she could have burned them as he had burned the false one and been none the poorer. She tied the ribbon again and kept them. She put them in the cedar box that had been her mother's, where she kept the things that mattered, not because she still needed to read them, but because they were hers, written in her own true hand, and they had told the truth all along, even when no one would let them be heard. They had been kept once to keep 2 people apart. She would keep them now for the opposite reason, as proof that the truth, however long it is intercepted and however far it is hidden, has a way of completing its journey in the end, even if it must wait 20 years and travel by way of a dying woman's conscience to do it. That is the thing about a letter in the end. It is patient. It does not stop being true because it goes unread. It waits in its drawer, sealed or broken, carrying its small freight of someone's whole heart for as long as it must, until the day a hand it was always meant for finally takes it up. If you have a letter in you that has waited a long time to arrive, this is a place where such things are heard. They arrive here, like a letter that was always true, finally taken up by the hand it was meant for whenever they are ready.